over the next few months, we're going to get a flurry of candidates appealing to a sense of the Filipino people, the Filipino nationalism, as a means to get them into office, as a means to get support from people. And I want to explore in this video some of the complications with Filipino nationalism that makes it quite difficult to really, establish properly and to spread. This has been a problem historically, and if you trace the history of the development of Filipino nationalism towards, say, like maybe sometime in the 1800s, you'll see that the notion of the Filipino as a citizen of the Philippines was not really very firmly established, and definitely not firmly established throughout the country. This idea of the Filipino originally meant Spanish people who were born in the Philippines, but later on there were many attempts to broaden that definition to include all of the people who live in the Philippines, including the Indios and the Moros and all the different people from the different Filipino tribes. But this process of wanting to create the idea of the Filipino was a very conscious one, meaning there were people who specifically thought in their heads and planned around with a bunch of other people thinking, how can we develop Filipino nationalism? How can we make Filipinos proud to be Filipinos? There were a couple of different people who were a part of this, history of developing Filipino nationalism. And one of the early ones that we're all familiar with are the Ilustrados. Now, when the Ilustrados, for those who are unfamiliar or who've forgotten, the Ilustrados were some of the early Filipinos who came from middle class or sometimes elite families who studied in Spain or in Europe towards the end of the 1800s. So in the 1870s, Spain, the Spanish government really liberalized, and there was more movement between Spain and the Philippines in terms of having more Filipinos have the capacity to travel. I think it coincided with the opening of the Suez Canal in the 1870s. And so during this time, there was more of an interaction between Filipinos and people in Europe. And during this period of time, there was like a new generation of educated Filipinos who were educated by European standards in various countries in Europe. During this time, they were immersed in an environment with so many different people from different nationalities and ethnicities. So, you were the average person who was, you lived here all your life, and then you finally had the chance to go away and you go to Europe, and you see that in Europe, there's so many different countries, and every person has their own, heritage that they are proud of. And they share their culture with each other, they talk about their culture. All of this is in the context of the imperialism that was happening, or the colonialism that was happening across the world, around the world. And towards the end of the 1800s, there was also just a sense that there were the colonizers who, the era of the colonizers were coming to a close, or they were being challenged more fervently for the first time. And some of these colonizers were, countries like Spain or the UK, or, for France, for example. Or Japan, even to some degree. So there were all these there's a sense, for example, in India, where a part of the ways in which they were trying to develop Indian nationalism was appealing to a past that they had, to this pre-colonial past before the British came, where they had developed a whole catalog of philosophy, of the arts, of literature. And so in India, they would look back into the past and say, actually, our heritage, our history is actually older than the British, history. And therefore they were trying to give these arguments that would say that, well, the Indians have a history that they can be proud of, separate, distinct from colonial history. And to some degree, they even would say it was greater than that of the history of the colonizers. So because we know this happened in other parts of the world as well. And so the Filipinos who were in Europe at the time, coming from the colonized countries, coming from the Philippines, we're hearing about these people and these movements around the world, one of them being in India, for example, where they were kind of reclaiming their history by looking into their past and using that as the basis for, pushing forth a new nationalism that could push back against the colonial regime, the British colonial regime. And so some Filipinos were tried to take this path as well. So they would look back into history and say, what do we know about pre-colonial Filipino history? Many of them were these intellectuals who would go into the books, into the libraries, and they'd look for documents from the past and see how much can be discovered about Filipino history or Filipino pre-colonial history, so that we can put it together in a way that can bolster the imaginations and bolster the sense of pride that the local people have for themselves, apart from, in a way that is separate from the Spanish people. So there were these movements with the Ilustrados where they were trying to find this, but what they had a difficulty finding a good record of the pre-colonial history here in the Philippines, because there just unfortunately wasn't really that much there. Most of what we know of pre-colonial history was written by early priests that came during the early Spanish colonial period, who were describing what they were seeing, but often under the lens of their Christianity or their own perspectives. And so everything was really colored in this way that was difficult to parse out. It was difficult to say, well, what is pre-colonial history? Over the years, over the century since the Ilustrados came, we've been learning a little bit more about pre-colonial history, but really there are no real kind of concrete documents that are very detailed about what it was like here in the Philippines, in different parts of the Philippines, specifically, in the centuries before the Spanish colonial rule in the 1500s, in the 1600s, I mean. So, no, 1500s. 1521 was Magellan. So this was the thing, right? So they had a difficult time kind of putting together history. And so to some degree they were exaggerating. They were even making stuff up. They were trying to draw connections to the Philippine writing systems and stuff like this, to Sanskrit, to all these different older, more established histories, in order to make a claim, to make a case that the Filipinos can be proud of themselves. And this is one of the first few notions of developing a really proper Filipino nationality, that included that in the idea of, say, Jose Rizal, it would have included all of the Filipinos who lived in the Philippines in a way that they were not included before. This development of the Filipino nationality in history was kind of abruptly stopped because of the revolution that happened in 1898 with the Spanish-Filipino War and the transition into the American colonial system. Because there was really a sense of a momentum from the 1880s to the 1890s, and even to the end of that decade, Spain was liberalizing to such an extent that things were actually quite good in Manila, and different parts of the Philippines, different city centers in the Philippines are actually quite prosperous already in the 1890s. But it just so happens, while things were getting better, the colonial powers changed hands, and we had wars and stuff. And during the American administration, through the help of various Filipinos that they had educated in the U.S., they created a new history for us to look to. So they said, well, okay, now that the Spanish era is over, there was a very strong contrast. There was a tension between how much should we continue to uphold our Spanish heritage versus removing it and restarting again. And so one of the ways in which history was kind of restarted, and from what I understand, is through framing the beginning of Filipino history of sorts, not necessarily the literal beginning, but the ideological beginning, the kind of symbolic beginning as the Katipunan, with a revolution against Spain, not against America, but against Spain. So this is why we get people like Andres Bonifacio and Emilio Aguinaldo in the early days as people who, it seems like they birthed Philippine history, when in reality Philippine history was a thing, for centuries before that as well. If you think of Philippines at least as a congregation of the islands. But so there was a restarting of the thing where now Philippine history begins with the Katipunan, is one of the first significant things is the Katipunan. And the people who were part of the Katipunan, who represented the Katipunan, who were members of the Katipunan after the war, were able to assume positions in the American colonial government, and in a way they were able to further cement the story of the Filipino people as being pivoted by this and being kind of birthed by the Katipunan. But in reality, it's very complicated, because one of the problems with this thing is that the Katipunan was a very localized event. The revolutions were, mostly in Luzon, the majority of the country live outside of those areas, and there are parts of the country that in this new version of what the birthing of Philippine history is, there's a huge part of the country, the majority of the country is not part of that story. So in the sense of a Filipino nationalism, we'll think of Filipino nationalism, it is structured in a way that has as its pivot Manila, with the Katipunan and the Luzon areas as the main place where Philippines was sort of created in the more new modern sense. But people in Mindanao, people in Maguindanao right now, people in various parts of Visayas, people who lived in Sulu, people who lived all over the country, their stories, they have their own stories, they have their own separate histories apart from the histories of what happened here with the revolutions of against Spain in that specific kind of Katipunan framework. But their histories are gone. We don't acknowledge them, we don't think about them, we don't engage with them, we don't study them. There are a few books that have come out about specific variations of how revolution happened on the ground in, say, like Cebu or Iloilo. There's some books, Davao, but it's not really read or taught in schools. And so there's a sense in which Manila, or this area where Intramuros was and all this stuff, it becomes the Philippines, it becomes Philippine history. And therefore, in the creation of like a Filipino nationalism, how can you say that it embodies the entirety of the history of the people when the majority of the literal kind of numbers of people were not even considered as relevant to the story of the foundation of the Republic? It's not like in, say, a different country where, say, the United States, where there were all these representatives and then they had to all agree from the different states, the early states, to create this constitution, to create the country. It was mostly, there was one revolution there was one among many revolutions that became the representative of the whole country's revolution, the whole country's struggle. And that framework of thinking about Philippine history, that very narrow framework that ignores the history of so much else of the country, is what creates a lot of this inability to really foment a really sturdy, a very strong sense of Filipino nationalism, because the Filipino nationalism for many people does not include them. In the history of what you learn in school or what is nationalized, what is on TV, it often does not include the Filipinos who are actually a part of the country that are still important. And this is the reason why it's when you think of, say, what do the people want, what do the Filipinos want, it's a difficult thing to conceptualize, because the Filipino people is a multitude in a way that is very different from other countries around the world. Other countries have variations in the population, but the Philippines is a special case in that there's so much of it. It's similar to, say, like Indonesia, where because of how our country is geographically structured, individual islands and individual parts of the country lived separate from each other. They were not united in any way, and they had different histories, and they had different important people within their histories. They have different histories of rebellion, all of which fall to the wayside because of like the arbitrary notion that Manila was where the politics was, where the center of politics was, and therefore they wrote the history books. They wrote the ways in which we're supposed to embody Filipino nationalism in a way that I think doesn't resonate with many people in the country, because that sense of a broad sense, even if you talk about EDSA revolution, all of this stuff, it's very localized in a way that, again, ignores many people. And so when the problem that comes out of it is that it's easy to think that Manila is the Philippines, that people who experience things in Manila, like this, the experience of living in Manila is the experience of living in the Philippines, but really the Philippines is a multitude that gets flattened out in the process of the creation and the propagation and the study of history. And the development of nationalism is impeded, or it's not able to really properly come to a useful fruition, because we're not acknowledging to the degree that we should the diversity of the histories of the people, and the different problems that everyone faces differently depending on where you're localized. And so all of this stuff makes it difficult to really feel like, well, there's such a thing as like a people that constitutes the majority of the country. And over the next few months, we're going to be hearing lots of talking about the massa, or the people, what the massa wants, or what the Filipinos want. And I think it's important to consider and to think about what exactly that means in practice on the everyday lives of the majority of the people who live all around the country, not just within Manila, but all around to all of the country.